Chapter 29. He had been riding Tug for several hours, and now they were across the river. It seemed a good time to switch horses. He loosened Tug's saddle girth. The little horse looked slightly insulted. "I can keep going, you know." "I know you can," Will told him gently. "But I'll be relying on you later, when we're all bone-tired." Tug shook his mane. He agreed, but he didn't have to like it. Even though Abelard was his friend, he would prefer to carry Will himself. He knew, even if Will didn't, that he could do it day after day, hour after hour, without wearing himself out. Will tightened Abelard's girth strap. There was no need to look out for tricks. Unlike some horses, ranger horses would never fill their lungs with a deep breath to expand their bodies while a strap was being tightened, only to release the breath and loosen the strap as soon as it was buckled. He tugged the saddle experimentally and began to raise his left foot to the stirrup when he realized that Abelard had turned his head to look expectantly at him. "Of course," he said softly. "Excuse my bad manners." He looked the horse steadily in the eye and said the words Halt had told him so many years ago, outside old Bob's cottage in the woods. "Permettez-moi?" He hoped he had the accent right. His Gallic wasn't the best. But Abelard tossed his head encouragingly a few times, and Will put his foot in the stirrup and swung up astride Halt's horse. For a second he waited, wondering if he had said the password correctly, wondering if Abelard was simply waiting for him to relax so he could toss him high in the air to have him come crashing down on the grass. Strangely, in all the years he and Halt had been together, he had never had occasion to ride Abelard before this. Given that the little horse had known him for years and recognized him as a friend of Halt's, he doubted that he would throw him off. But training was training. After a few seconds, he realized that there was going to be no violent corkscrewing explosion of horseflesh under him. Abelard was waiting patiently for the signal to proceed. Will twitched Kicker's lead rein to get his attention, then touched his heels to Abelard's barrel of a body, and they moved off, building gradually to the familiar lope. They rode clear of the fertile flats that bounded the river. The trees began to thin out so that they were occasional clumps and outcrops set among the grassy downs. There was a faint path, sometimes difficult to see, but there were few obstructions and the horses were all sure-footed, even Kicker. They made good time as the sun sank inexorably closer to the western horizon, firing the low clouds' undersides with a rich orange and purple glare. From time to time, as they crested a hill, he could see glimpses of the grey, stark expanse of the drowned forest off to the east, but they became fewer and fewer as he made progress. When darkness fell, he spelled the horses again, letting them drink sparingly from the small folding leather bucket that he carried for the purpose. He took a large swig of the coffee, now with almost no trace of heat left in it. But the taste and the sweetness revived him. The moon was due to rise in an hour, and he decided to wait for it. He was travelling unfamiliar ground, and sure-footed as they might be, he didn't want to risk one of the horses stumbling or falling. He'd switch back to Tug when they set out again. It was time to do so anyway, and while Tug and Abelard were very similar, Abelard's gait was slightly different, a little stiffer and more abrupt. In time, he knew, he would become accustomed to it. But if they were travelling by night, he'd prefer to lead the way on Tug. After a time, the moon soared up over the eastern horizon, huge and silent and watchful while it was close to the horizon, seeming to shrink as it reached higher into the night sky. He put an arm around Abelard's neck, letting the horse nuzzle against him. "Thanks, Abelard," he said. Then, on an impulse, "Merci bien, mon ami. You've done well." The little horse rumbled acknowledgement and butted against him several times. Kicker, grazing nearby, looked up as Will retrieved his lead rope from the tree where it was tied and moved to mount Tug. Once again in the familiar saddle, even Halt's saddle felt slightly different to his own. He looked around at the other two horses, patiently waiting his command. "All right, boys," he said. "Let's get going." He was tired, inestimably tired, and his body ached in 100 different muscles. He had changed back to Abelard, then to Tug once more, and even the familiar saddle created its own form of torture for his aching legs and back and behind. He estimated that it was after midnight, so he had been riding, with a few brief stops, for well over 12 hours. And while he was riding, he was also concentrating fiercely. Concentrating on the course they were following, steering by the stars. Watching the ground ahead of them, alert for any obstacles or dangers. The effort that went into this sort of concentration was almost as exhausting as the physical exertion. The moon had set hours ago, but he continued by starlight. The trees were becoming fewer and further between, and he was climbing gradually to a plateau. The terrain now was a series of bare knolls, covered only by long, wind-swept grass. Soon, he decided, he would have to stop for a brief rest. Once again, it would be the lesser of two undesirable alternatives. If he kept riding too long, his attention would wander, and sheer fatigue might lead him to a mistake, a wrong direction, or a poor choice of path. In the back of his mind, he nursed the fear that one of the horses might stumble or fall and injure himself because of some mistake made by Will, a mistake he might not have made if he had all his wits about him. Once, they startled a large animal close to the faint trail they were following. There was a brief snarl of surprise, and it bounded away, disappearing into the long grass before he could get a good look at it. The horses started nervously. Kicker neighed in alarm and pulled at the lead rope, nearly jerking the exhausted young ranger from the saddle. He had no idea what the animal might have been. A wolf, perhaps, or a large hunting cat. He had heard that there was a species of lynx in this part of the country that could grow as large as a small bear. Or it could have been a bear. Whatever it was, if they chanced upon another one, he needed to have his wits about him. He realized with a guilty start that he had actually been dozing in the saddle when they had blundered upon it. Almost certainly, Tug and Abelard would have given him warnings, but he had been too exhausted to notice them. He reined Tug in. It was time to stop and have a substantial rest, to close his eyes and sleep, if only for half an hour, and let his body be revitalized. Half an hour's proper sleep would do it, and as he had the thought, the idea of stretching flat out, rolling himself in his warm cloak, and letting his eyes close and stay closed was too much to resist. He glanced around the surrounding countryside. The terrain had been rising for some time now, and they were close to the top of a large bare hill. In the distance, he made out several irregular shapes in the dim starlight, and for a moment he frowned, wondering what they were. Then he realized. They were the barrows, the ancient burial mounds of long-dead warriors. He recalled his flippant remark to Horace, "Some folk think they're haunted." It had tripped off the tongue so easily in the daylight, scores of kilometers away. Now, here on this bare hill, with only the dim light of the stars, the whole idea seemed more forbidding, the barrows themselves more ominous. "Great place you picked for a rest," he muttered to himself. and, groaning with the effort, swung down from Tug's back. His knees gave slightly as he touched the ground, and he staggered a pace or two. Then he fastened Kicker's lead rope to Tug's saddle bow, loosened the little horse's girth strap, and looked for a clear space in the grass. Ghosts or no ghosts, he had to sleep. The ground was hard, and the cold struck through his cloak. But the moment he first stretched out and groaned softly with pleasure, it felt as soft as the softest goose-down mattress underneath him. He closed his eyes. He would wake in half an hour, he knew. If by any chance he didn't, Tug would wake him. But that was half an hour away. He woke. Instinctively, he knew that he hadn't been asleep for the full 30 minutes he had allotted himself. Something had woken him. Something foreign. Something hostile. There had been no noise, he realized, as he tracked his thoughts back a few seconds. No sound had intruded into his consciousness to arouse him. It was something else, something he could feel rather than see or hear. A presence. Something or someone was close by. There was no outward sign that he was awake. His eyes were slitted so that he could see, without any observer realizing that they were open. His breathing maintained the same steady rhythm that it had fallen into a few seconds after he had stretched out. He took stock of the situation, reminding himself of where everything lay around him. The hilt of his sax knife dug into his right side, where he had lain the double scabbard as he settled into sleep. The fingers of his left hand touched the smooth surface of his bow, wrapped with him inside the cloak to protect the string from the dampness of the night air. If there were someone close by, the sax would be the better choice, he thought. He could spring to his feet and have it drawn and ready in a matter of seconds. The bow would be more cumbersome. He searched his senses, trying to determine a direction. Something had disturbed him. He was sure of that. Now he tried to sense where it lay. He gave himself over to pure instinct. Where is it? Which direction? He forced all conscious thought from his mind, letting it become a blank, removing all extraneous distractions the same way he did in the instant before releasing an arrow. His senses told him left. He slid his eyes sideways, without moving his head. But he still had them slitted, feigning sleep, and he could see nothing. Nothing for it. He tossed and muttered, as if still asleep, and managed to turn his head to the left. Then he allowed his breathing to settle again into the deep, even rhythms of sleep. Something was there. He couldn't see it clearly, but it was there. A huge, indistinct shape, perhaps a man, but larger than any man he'd ever seen. He had a vague impression of armour, ancient armour, with high-rising shoulder guards and a helmet decorated with huge, angular wings. Somehow, it looked familiar. He tried to remember where he had seen this figure before, but his memory retreated down an unlit corridor as soon as he made the attempt. He concentrated on continuing to breathe deeply and evenly. The temptation was to catch his breath as he considered the situation. He prepared himself, forcing oxygen into his limbs, ensuring that his mind was sharp and uncluttered, focused on what he was about to do. He rehearsed his actions in his mind. Right hand on the sax knife, draw it from the scabbard as he leapt to his feet, using his left hand to thrust up from the ground. Use his legs to spring up and to one side, in case the strange figure was prepared to strike at him. The sideways movement would force him to reconsider his stroke, and the delay would help Will survive the first few vital seconds. He prepared his muscles. His hand closed silently around the sax knife hilt. And then he was up. In one smooth, uncoiling movement, without any warning or visible preparation, he was on his feet and dancing to his right to avoid a possible sword or axe strike. The sax gleamed in his hand as he flicked it to release from its scabbard. He took up a combat crouch, the sax held out low before him, tip slightly raised, his knees tensed and ready to spring either way. The rest of his muscles loose and ready for instant movement, either attack or defense. Tug and Abelard both snorted in alarm at the sudden movement. Kicker, startled in his turn, but a little behind them, reared and tugged at his tether. There was nothing. No giant, indistinct warrior in ancient armour. No enemy ready to attack. There was just the starlit night and the gentle soughing of the wind through the long grass. Slowly, he relaxed, rising from his crouch and lowering the point of the sax so that it lay alongside his thigh. Then he remembered why the shape had seemed familiar. The night warrior, the terrifying illusion that Malcolm had created in Grimsdale Wood, had looked like that. With that realization, he allowed the last of the tension to flow out of his body. He dropped the sax point down into the soft ground and slumped wearily. Had he dreamt it? Had his imagination, fed by the thought of the barrows and the legends of ancient ghosts, simply created the situation? He frowned, thinking. He was sure that he had been fully awake just before he leapt to his feet. But had he? Or had he been in that deceptive state of half-sleep, half-wakefulness that so often took an exhausted mind and body? And had an old memory stirred within him? He shook his head. He didn't know. He couldn't tell when he had woken fully. He walked to the horses. They definitely seemed alarmed, but then they would. After all, he had just leapt to his feet unexpectedly, waving his sax knife around like a lunatic. He approached Tug and Abelard now. Both of them stood tensed, ears pricked, alert and nervous. Tug shifted his weight from one foot to another. Kicker had relaxed again, but Kicker wasn't trained to the fine edge of awareness that the Ranger horses were. Tug made that familiar low rumbling noise in his chest. Often that was a sign of danger, or that he was uncertain. Will stroked his nose, speaking gently to him. "What is it, boy? Do you feel something?" Undoubtedly, the little horse did. But whether it was some presence close by, or whether he was simply reacting to Will's sense of alarm, Will couldn't tell. Gradually, as Tug settled down and his eyes stopped flicking from one point to another in the surrounding night, Will decided that it was the latter. Tug and Abelard were nervous and alert simply because they could sense the same sense of alarm in him. After all, they had made no warning sound as he lay, feigning sleep. Gradually, Will's own racing pulse settled, and he came to accept that there had been nothing. It had all been the result of imagination, combined with exhaustion. The fact that the intruder had appeared to look like the night warrior finally convinced him that it had come from within his own mind, and he felt slightly foolish. He retrieved his sax knife, replaced it in the scabbard, and buckled the scabbard round his waist. Then he donned his cloak, shaking some of the damp from it first, slung his quiver over his shoulder, and picked up his bow. "Imagination or not," he said softly, "I'm not staying here a second longer." He tightened the girth on Abelard's saddle and mounted. Then, leading Kicker and with Tug trotting beside him, he rode quickly away from his temporary resting place. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled slightly, but he didn't look back. Behind him, in the darkness, the ancient, invisible presence that inhabited the hill slipped silently back to its resting place, satisfied that another interloper had moved on.